Hi, everyone. I'm Carla Qualtrough. I'd like to begin by thanking Richard Reiser and the Commonwealth Disabled Persons Forum, both for warmly welcoming me into the CDPF family and for inviting me to address you at your AGM. Nearly 20 years ago, on December 13th, 2006, the international community did something extraordinary. The United Nations adopted the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the UNCRPD, an agreement that did far more than add another treaty to the international system. It changed the way the world understands disability itself. And let me be clear, this didn't magically happen because progress simply unfolds on its own. It didn't happen because systems were ready or institutions were eager to change. It happened because of the tireless work, leadership, and persistence of the disability community and advocates around the world. Rights were not given, they were demanded. Before 2006, disability was most often framed as a personal tragedy, a medical condition, or a matter for charity. People with disabilities were seen as objects of care, not as subjects of rights. Decisions were made about us, not with us. Barriers were treated as inevitable facts of life rather than as systemic failures of design, policy, and political will. The UNCRPD marked a turning point. It declared clearly and unequivocally that persons with disabilities are rights holders, entitled to dignity, autonomy, equality, and full participation in society. And since that moment, the world has been changing. Today, I want to reflect on some of the most noticeable disability rights advances around the world since the UNCRPD was adopted. Not as a victory lap, and certainly not as a declaration that the work is done. Quite the opposite. I want us to take stock honestly of how far we've come and how far we still must go. I'm not suggesting that we'll have figured it all out or that our systems are now welcoming and disability inclusive. They're not. But I do believe it's important, especially in challenging times, to pause and recognize the progress that has been made and to understand why it matters. I'll also share some examples from my own country, Canada. The most profound achievement of the UNCRPD has been the global paradigm shift it set in motion. The convention reframed disability as a human rights issue, rooted not in individual impairment, but in the interaction between people and the barriers they face. This shift from a medical or charity model to a human rights model has reshaped law, policy, and advocacy across every region of the world. It has influenced court decisions, constitutional interpretation, and national debates about equality and inclusion. It has made one thing unmistakably clear: exclusion is not inevitable. It is the result of choices. And if exclusion is the result of choices, then inclusion can be as well. This paradigm shift has also changed expectations. People with disabilities are demanding equal treatment, equal access, equal opportunity, and equal respect. Pardon me. Another remarkable advance since 2006 has been the level of global commitment to the convention itself. The UNCRPD is now one of the most widely ratified human rights treaties in history. To date, 193 states have become parties to the convention, along with regional bodies such as the European Union. But ratification alone is not progress. Commitment without action is not compliance. The convention's reporting and review process, requiring states to report regularly to the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, carries real moral and political weight, and it's very important. It shines a light. It creates transparency. It allows civil society to hold governments to account. But it's not enforcement. What has proven especially powerful for lawmakers and advocates alike are the committee's authoritative interpretations of the convention. These interpretations clarify what equality, accessibility, legal capacity, and inclusion actually require in practice. They've been relied on repeatedly in law reform processes, court decisions, academic work, and advocacy around the world. They translate principle into obligation and aspiration into standards. In many countries, the UNCRPD has acted as a catalyst for legal reform. Since 2006, governments across regions have adopted new disability rights laws or revised existing ones to align with the convention's principles. These reforms have strengthened protections against discrimination, expanded recognition of disability, and embedded inclusion across sectors such as education, employment, housing, transportation, and healthcare. In some countries, the convention has influenced constitutional interpretation, helping courts recognize disability as a protected ground of equality. In others, it has driven the consolidation of fragmented policies into comprehensive legal frameworks grounded in rights rather than welfare. In Canada, one of the most significant outcomes of this shift is the Accessible Canada Act of 2019. This historic legislation commits Canada to become barrier-free by 2040 through a proactive and systemic approach to identifying, removing, and preventing barriers. It established a National Accessibility Standards Organization, created the position of Chief Accessibility Officer within the federal government, and introduced an Accessibility Commissioner within the Canadian Human Rights Commission to oversee and enforce the Act. Alongside this, Canada adopted its first ever Disability Inclusion Action Plan. Together, these measures form the foundation of Canada's legal and policy framework for disability inclusion. These developments illustrate one of the clearest and most practical advances since the UNCRPD, the elevation of accessibility from a policy aspiration to a legal obligation. The Convention recognizes accessibility as a precondition for equality. Without access to buildings, transportation, information, communication, and technology, other rights remain theoretical. Since 2006, countries and regions, Canada included, have adopted enforceable accessibility standards covering public infrastructure, transit systems, digital services, and communication. The concept of universal design, creating environments usable by all people to the greatest extent possible, has gained prominence in legislation, regulation, and professional practice. This represents a fundamental change. Accessibility is no longer something to be considered where feasible. It's something to be planned for, budgeted for, and delivered as a matter of rights. Another important area of progress since 2006 concerns legal capacity, the right to make decisions about one's own life. Historically, many people with disabilities, particularly those with intellectual or psychosocial disabilities, were denied this right through guardianship regimes that transferred decision-making power to others. The UNCRPD challenged this approach directly. The Convention affirms that persons with disabilities have legal capacity on an equal basis with others, and it calls for supported decision-making systems that respect individual will and preferences. One of the most frequently cited authoritative interpretations of the Convention addresses this very issue. States were misinterpreting their obligations under Article 12 and continuing discriminatory practices under the guise of care or protection. The CRPD committee clearly stated that removing rights is not protection, and that support, not substitution, is the human rights compliant response. Since the Convention's adoption, this principle has reshaped debates around mental health, guardianship, consent, and access to justice. While implementation remains uneven and contested, the normative shift is undeniable. Autonomy, not paternalism, is now the standard against which laws are measured. In Canada, we still have a long way to go. Substitute decision-making remains entrenched, and we continue to maintain a reservation that limits full legal capacity for some persons with disabilities. The UN Committee has been clear. True compliance requires withdrawing that reservation, ending disability-based decision-making, and replacing it with supported decision-making grounded in a person's will and preferences. Until that happens, Canada has not yet met the promise of Article 12. Now, the influence of the UNCRPD extends beyond domestic law. It's reshaping international development and humanitarian policy as well. Disability is increasingly recognized as a cross-cutting issue within the Sustainable Development Goals. Governments and international agencies now acknowledge that poverty reduction, education, gender equality, and climate resilience cannot be achieved without including persons with disabilities. Similarly, humanitarian actors are under growing pressure to ensure that emergency responses, whether to conflict, displacement, or natural disasters, do not leave persons with disabilities behind. To be clear, acknowledging that inclusion is necessary and actually delivering it are not the same thing. Pressure to act is not the same as action. But this shift in recognition is still a significant advance and one that should not be dismissed. Perhaps one of the most powerful legacies of the UNCRPD is the formal recognition of participation. The convention requires states to closely consult with and actively involve persons with disabilities and their representative organizations in decision-making processes. Rooted in the historic rallying cry of nothing about us without us, this principle is about doing things with us, not to us. Since 2006, organizations of persons with disabilities have gained greater access to policymaking spaces at national and international levels. We participate in UN reporting processes, shape law reform debates, and hold governments accountable in ways that were unimaginable just a generation ago. This shift has not only improved policy, it has strengthened democracy itself. In Canada, we have moved from nothing about us without us to the simpler truth, nothing without us. Too often, governments and decision makers are still acting as gatekeepers, deciding in advance whether an issue affects the disability community and therefore whether we should be included. But every decision a government makes affects persons with disabilities because everything is about us. Progress has been real, but it has been uneven. And around the world, people with disabilities continue to face poverty, exclusion, institutionalization, and violence. Laws on the books do not always translate into change in lived experience. Economic crises, conflict, and climate change threaten to widen existing inequalities. But the world of 2026 is not the world of 2006. Today, disability rights are firmly embedded in international law. Accessibility is widely recognized as a matter of justice. Legal capacity is understood as a human right. And persons with disabilities are no longer silent subjects of policy. We are active agents of change. As I said earlier, the UNCRPD didn't create these advances on its own. They were won through decades of advocacy by persons with disabilities, our organizations, and our allies. But the convention gave those efforts a global framework, a shared language, and a powerful legal foundation. As we look ahead, the task before us is clear: to move from commitment to implementation, from formal equality to lived equality, and from isolated successes to systemic change. The UNCRPD catalyzed a global conversation about disability rights. It showed the world what is possible when dignity is placed at the center of policy. Our responsibility now is to ensure that its promise is fully realized for everyone, everywhere. Once again, thanks for inviting me to speak. Enjoy the rest of your AGM.